The French embassy in Burkina Faso was open for decades, until 15 minutes changed everything. One phone call, military trucks, and a bold order from President Traore set a chain reaction into motion. The shocking events that forced France out are still making waves today. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now back to the video. When Burkina Faso gained independence from France in 1960, it marked the end of formal colonial rule. But in reality, the ties between the two countries weren't severed. Instead, a new system emerged, one carefully built to maintain French influence across its former African colonies. This system, known as France-Afrique, operated behind the scenes, shaping politics, economics, and even military strategy in Burkina Faso and beyond. France-Afrique began as a strategy to secure France's access to the natural resources and markets of its former colonies while maintaining political sway. In Burkina Faso, this influence was wide-reaching. The country is one of Africa's largest producers of gold, contributing significant wealth to the global economy. However, French multinational corporations controlled major portions of the mining sector, reaping profits while leaving Burkina Faso minimal returns. For decades, this economic structure channeled wealth out of Africa, fueling French industry at the expense of local development. Beyond the economy, French military presence became deeply entrenched in Burkina Faso's affairs. Military bases dotted across the region were framed as tools for security and stability, especially as groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS gained ground in the Sahel. But this assistance came with strings attached. Decisions about security operations often prioritized French interests over local needs, creating tension. Operation Barkhane, which began in 2014 to combat terrorism in the Sahel, exemplified this dynamic. Though it mobilized thousands of French troops to the region, the operation failed to curb escalating violence in Burkina Faso, where attacks on civilians and security forces multiplied. Efforts that were supposed to bring stability instead saw the crisis deepen, further souring the public's trust in French intervention. The frustrations weren't limited to security concerns. Political influence formed another core mechanism of France's dominance. Burkina Faso's leaders often aligned their policies with Paris due to economic dependencies or political deals behind closed doors. This meant that despite being officially sovereign, the nation's decision-making power was limited. Leaders who challenged this arrangement historically faced significant pushback, either through diplomatic isolation or subtle political maneuvering. For much of Burkina Faso's post-independence history, it became clear that France's invisible hand shaped its path forward. As the years passed, resentment among the Burkinabe people grew. Protests erupted in major cities, demanding an end to what many viewed as modern-day neo-colonialism. Demonstrators carried signs rejecting France-Afrique and calling for the withdrawal of French troops and corporations. Chants of "France leave" became more frequent, echoing a broader movement across West Africa to challenge former colonial powers. For Burkinabe citizens, France's influence wasn't seen as protective. It was viewed as exploitative, complicit in their suffering as living conditions stagnated and insecurity rose. By the late 2000s and 10s, cracks in the French-Burkinabe relationship became impossible to ignore. While France's military presence was justified as a partnership against terrorism, many saw it as a failure to deliver on its promises, a tool to preserve French economic entry points rather than a real solution to local issues. As these tensions boiled over, a power vacuum emerged, fueled by dissatisfaction with leadership that seemed unable or unwilling to chart a truly independent course for the country. This environment set the stage for a turning point. In September 2022, amidst growing calls for change, a military officer named Captain Ibrahim Traore rose to prominence. At 34 years old, he embodied the frustration of a younger generation and the spirit of resistance against outside control. Traore's ascent would signal not just a shift in power, but a deep challenge to decades of French dominance. His actions didn't just target inefficiency or corruption. They sought to redefine Burkina Faso's role on the world stage. And with him, the long, unquestioned system of Françafrique was about to face its most direct confrontation yet. At just 34 years old, Captain Ibrahim Traore became the youngest leader in the world when he led a coup in September 2022, toppling the government of Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. Traore's rise wasn't the result of personal ambition alone. He represented a growing frustration within Burkina Faso's military ranks, especially among younger officers who believed that the government's efforts to combat the spiraling jihadist insurgency were falling short. At the heart of the dissent was a lack of faith in both domestic leadership and foreign allies, particularly France, whose military presence in the region had yielded little progress in restoring security. The security crisis Traoré inherited when he seized power was impossible to ignore. Vast swaths of Burkina Faso had fallen under the control of militant groups linked to al-Qaeda and ISIS. Entire communities were displaced as attacks grew more frequent and violent. Villages were razed, and thousands of civilians had been killed. Damiba's administration, which itself came to power through a coup just months earlier, had promised to address this instability, but failed to deliver results. Public trust in the government continued to erode, and protests became a common sight in Ouagadougou. Frustration wasn't just aimed at perceived incompetence within the government. It extended to the continued reliance on French troops, whose presence had not contained the crisis. This volatile environment made Traoré's bold intervention resonate with both the military and civilians alike. Traoré's coup was not accompanied by long speeches or grand proclamations. Instead, he issued clear and direct promises, a break from old systems of governance, and a focus on putting Burkina Faso's sovereignty first. Part of this vision included reassessing foreign partnerships, particularly the country's heavy reliance on France. From the outset, Traoré's skepticism of France's military assistance was evident. He questioned whether the continued presence of French bases in the region was a safeguard or merely a way for France to protect its own interests. This candid approach carved out a reputation for him as a leader willing to confront uncomfortable truths. He also hinted at seeking new international partnerships, specifically with Russia. While he avoided making explicit commitments early on, his openness to alternative security arrangements signaled a shift that deeply unsettled French officials. France's influence in Africa was already waning, as countries like Mali had taken decisive steps to cut ties with their former colonizer and bring in Russian security forces, including the controversial Wagner Group. The prospect of Burkina Faso following a similar path was seen as a direct blow to France's regional strategy and a threat to its ability to project power in the Sahel. Traoré's alignment with the frustrations of the Burkinabe people helped cement his popularity at home. Young Burkinabe in particular viewed him as a figure of resistance, someone unafraid to stand up against the systems that had failed them for decades. Scenes of jubilant crowds chanting his name and waving the national flag became a regular occurrence, reinforcing the image of a new leader determined to forge a different path. His unpolished, straightforward demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the traditional political elite, further endearing him to those disillusioned with past administrations. Meanwhile, the relationship with France continued to sour under Traoré's leadership. He made it clear that Burkina Faso would no longer tolerate arrangements that left its people vulnerable while outsiders benefited. His administration began scaling back cooperation with French forces, demanding the closure of certain military facilities and asserting a more independent defense strategy. Diplomatic exchanges between the two governments grew tense, with French officials expressing concerns over Traoré's rhetoric and Burkina Faso's potential realignment. One of the most striking indicators of this shift came through Traoré's increasingly assertive leadership style. In a series of moves that seemed designed to test France's resolve, he pushed back on diplomatic protocols and military agreements, refusing to allow French officials the same degree of influence they had once enjoyed. Each confrontation escalated the rift between the two countries, making clear that their relationship was on a collision course. This growing tension all led to a dramatic moment: Traoré's visit to the French embassy. What he encountered there and how he responded marked not just a turning point in their diplomatic relations, but a defining moment for Burkina Faso's post-colonial history. The question is, How could one seemingly routine interaction ignite such a dramatic and irreversible shift? President Traore's visit to the French embassy started quietly, but it ended with a statement the world could not ignore. Without the usual fanfare of a presidential motorcade, Traore walked straight to the embassy gates carrying sensitive intelligence he intended to deliver personally to the French ambassador. By skipping intermediaries, he not only underscored the importance of the matter, but also demonstrated a hands-on leadership style that had already made him popular among the Burkinabe people. Yet the response he received at those gates sparked one of the most consequential moments in Burkina Faso's modern history. As he approached, two French security guards stopped Traoré before he could reach the doors. They didn't ask for identification or acknowledge him with any formalities. Instead, one of the guards, tall and pale-skinned, dismissed him outright, saying, "No entry. This building is not for street visitors. Go around, make an appointment." The air of condescension was unmistakable. The president of Burkina Faso, on his own soil, was treated as though he were an intruder. When Traoré calmly requested to see the ambassador, the situation escalated further. The guards didn't adjust their tone or apologize for their earlier remarks. Instead, one suggested he send an email, and the other added with a smirk, "Unless you're bringing lunch or a delivery, move along." The layers of disrespect in this interaction weren't lost on Traoré, nor would they go unnoticed by the nation at large. To fully understand what happened next, it's important to consider the weight of that moment. For decades, France had dominated its former colony, dictating the terms of policies and partnerships. Many Burkinabe viewed this relationship as not just unequal, but humiliating. Now in the 21st century, a young president seeking to redefine that dynamic stood at the gates of his former colonizer's embassy, only to be treated as if he were still subordinate. This was no small insult. It symbolized everything Traoré had vowed to dismantle. Traoré, however, didn't raise his voice or make a scene. He simply stepped back, pulled out his phone, and made a quiet call. Within 15 minutes, the embassy gates were surrounded by 3 military trucks. Burkinabe soldiers, armed and composed, took up positions along the perimeter, establishing a silent but unmistakable show of authority. The message was clear. This was no longer France's playground. With the embassy now encircled, the guards who had dismissed Traoré minutes earlier found themselves outnumbered and unable to act. Without hesitation, Traoré issued an order to close the French embassy on the spot. This kind of decision would normally involve lengthy discussions, diplomatic notes, and public statements. But not this time. Traoré bypassed every conventional channel, emphasizing the urgency and seriousness of his stance. He wouldn't wait for an apology, nor would he allow another display of disrespect. The embassy's operations were shut down immediately, with French diplomats given a short window to leave the country. Inside the building, the mood turned chaotic. Phones rang endlessly as embassy officials scrambled to understand what had just happened. Frantic calls to Paris described an unfolding crisis. The French Foreign Ministry quickly issued carefully worded statements referring to a misunderstanding, but their efforts to downplay the incident came too late. On the ground, the momentum of Traoré's actions left no room for negotiation. French diplomats began evacuating under the watchful eyes of Burkinabe soldiers stationed nearby. The embassy closure was swift and complete, but its implications extended far beyond that moment. Formal relations between Burkina Faso and France were suspended indefinitely, leaving all communication reliant on third-party channels. The economic and political ties that had bound the two countries for decades entered uncertain territory. Meanwhile, on the streets of Ouagadougou, word of Traoré's actions spread quickly. Crowds gathered in celebration, seeing the moment as a powerful assertion of national sovereignty. As France's influence in Burkina Faso receded, so too did its broader foothold in the region. The embassy incident wasn't just about a single disrespectful interaction. It became a symbol of Africa's growing willingness to reject its former colonial powers. But this wasn't the end of the story. Not for Traoré and not for Burkina Faso. The closure of the French embassy in Ouagadougou wasn't just a sudden diplomatic fallout. It marked the collapse of a deeply unequal relationship that had endured for decades. For Burkina Faso, it was the clearest statement yet. The age of humiliation and subordination was over. The move reverberated across Africa, raising a pressing question: how many more countries are ready to confront their colonial legacies and demand respect on their terms? As Burkina Faso asserts its independence, Traore's next steps remain crucial. Whatever comes next, one thing is clear: this is the beginning of a new chapter, not its conclusion.